From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We want to open the door towards national salvation that the Lebanese people are taking part in, and thus I am announcing today the resignation of this government.
After days of protests, Lebanon's government resigns following last week's devastating explosion in Beirut that has killed 200 and injured thousands. We'll go to Beirut for the latest. Then how did it come to this? We'll speak to The Atlantic's Ed Young about how the coronavirus has humbled and humiliated the planet's most powerful nation.
We are now in this situation where the virus was never brought to heel and is now raging out of control again. We talk a lot about second wave. We never even escaped to the first one.
And we'll go inside San Quentin Prison in California, where 25 prisoners have died from COVID-19 in the nation's largest coronavirus outbreak. We'll hear from 2 prisoners who contracted the virus about where some infected prisoners were taken.
I call it the bowels of San Quentin because it's so dark, it's so dank. There was no electricity. Hot water was sparse.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The government of Lebanon stepped down Monday night amidst mounting unrest and rage over last week's catastrophic explosion at the port of Beirut. As he announced his cabinet's resignation in a televised address, Prime Minister Hassan Diab said, quote, "Corruption is bigger than the state." At least 200 people were killed in the blast, which was triggered by 2,700 tons of highly explosive ammonium nitrate left unattended in a warehouse for 6 years. The devastating explosion came at a time when Lebanon was already facing a political, economic, and public health crisis. We'll go to Beirut after headlines with historian Ziad Abu-Rish. The Trump administration is considering blocking U.S. citizens and permanent residents from re-entering the United States if they're suspected of having COVID-19. Critics say the proposed rule is part of Trump's ongoing effort to seal the U.S. southern border with Mexico. Meanwhile, as discussions over a new coronavirus bill continue to stall in Capitol Hill, governors across the United States express frustration with President Trump's order for states to cover a quarter of the cost of enhanced unemployment benefits, as states are already reeling from shortages in revenue due to the pandemic. More evidence is emerging of a rise in infections among children. A new report found that pediatric cases are up 90% from last month. President Trump dismissed recent reports yesterday, insisting again it's safe to open schools because children are much less affected by the virus.
They don't get very sick, and according to the people that I've spoken to, they don't transport it or transfer it to other people, or certainly not very easily. So, yeah, I think schools have to open. We want to get our economy going.
During Trump's news conference Monday night, he was evacuated after Secret Service shot a suspect outside the White House. Secret Service said the White House was not breached and the man was sent to a hospital. Apparently, he was not armed. In other education news, over 500 people from a Georgia school district have been placed in quarantine due to COVID-19 since school started last week. Last week, the Bureau of Indian Education, which is part of the Interior Department, announced it would reopen 53 in-person schools across 10 states September 16th. In international news, the number of global coronavirus cases has surpassed 20 million. Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced Russia's the first country to approve a COVID-19 vaccine, even stating his daughter had already received it. The regulatory approval was granted as the vaccine is still going through clinical trials. In New Zealand, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has ordered the city of Auckland into lockdown and for other measures to be renewed in the rest of New Zealand after 4 people from one Auckland family contracted COVID-19. This comes just 2 days after New Zealand celebrated 100 days without a domestic transmission. In Chicago, over 100 people were arrested early Monday morning after the police clashed with protesters, accusing them of looting upscale stores in Chicago's Magnificent Mile shopping district. The massive overnight protest was sparked by the police shooting Sunday of a 20-year-old man. Police allege the man, Latrell Allen, opened fire on police officers first. Allen has been hospitalized and charged with attempted murder. On Monday, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot announced a lockdown with massive police presence in parts of Chicago. Meanwhile, in Portland, Oregon, at least 16 people were arrested Monday morning as massive protests against police brutality and racial violence continue. Among those arrested was Demetria Hester, a black woman and hate crime survivor who was assaulted by a white supremacist 3 years ago. Belarus remains in political turmoil as protests continued for a second day, leaving one person dead after incumbent President Alexander Lukashenko was declared the winner of Sunday's election with 80% of the vote. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, his main challenger, fled to neighboring Lithuania after she refused to concede. At a news briefing before she left, she condemned the brutal police crackdown on protesters who were met with tear gas, rubber bullets and stun grenades.
People went out peacefully to defend their voices. Yesterday they made their choice. People had a celebration, and to start suppressing people with harsh methods, literally in a couple of hours, it is a crime.
Meanwhile, the authoritarian regime of Lukashenko is ramping up its attack on journalists, assaulting and arresting multiple reporters during the demonstrations. Another person currently behind bars is Vitaly Shklarov, a former campaign staffer for Bernie Sanders and Barack Obama. He's married to an American and had been helping on the campaign of Svetlana's husband, Sergei Tsikhanouski, who had planned to run for president before he was arrested in May. In Bolivia, protests are intensifying against the government of right-wing interim President Janine Áñez after it delayed presidential elections last month for the second time, citing the pandemic. Blockades have been set up for over a week as the Bolivian Workers' Union has called for a general strike and for elections to be moved up to from October to September throughout Bolivia. This is protester from El Alto.
The Bolivian people of El Alto are demanding the resignation of Janine Áñez and her lazy ministers. They are just using this moment to loot our country in the name of health.
In environmental news, the destruction of the Brazilian Amazon continues to accelerate, with the number of fires in 2020 up dramatically, even compared to last year's devastating so-called fire season. Environmental groups say the fires are mostly the product of unlicensed loggers, ranchers and miners with the encouragement of far-right President Jair Bolsonaro. The last fully intact ice shelf in the Canadian Arctic has collapsed, losing over 40% of its area, a piece larger than the island of Manhattan, in just 2 days at the end of July. The ice shelf's melting has been attributed to rising temperatures, as the Canadian Arctic has been over 9 degrees Fahrenheit warmer this summer than the 30-year average. The Environmental Protection Agency is planning to rescind regulations for methane gas emissions and end requirements that oil and gas companies have mechanisms in place to detect methane leaks. The new rule changes are part of the Trump administration's ongoing efforts to ease regulations on the largest polluters. Methane accounts for around 10% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. In immigration news, advocates are urging Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that's ICE, to release a Mexican man imprisoned at the Adelanto ICE Processing Center in California and to remove him from a deportation list. Rights groups say ICE wants to deport Jose Tapete for speaking out against the jail's squalid and abusive conditions and neglectful practices amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, including the agency's use of harmful chemicals allegedly used to disinfect the jail. Tapete has been imprisoned at Adelanto for over 2 years and has schizophrenia. He's also participated in several hunger strikes. Meanwhile, the family of a 74-year-old South Korean immigrant, Chung-won-on, who died by suicide in May, is demanding California investigate the privately run Mesa Verde detention jail where he was locked up. The family says his death was preventable. A warning to our audience, the following 2 headlines contain disturbing images. Newly released police body cam video of George Floyd's killing shows medical personnel waited almost 3 minutes to perform chest compressions on an unresponsive Floyd. The footage also shows Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin killed him by kneeling on his neck for over 9 minutes, longer than what had previously been estimated. The video comes from the body cams of Alexander Kung and Thomas Lane, who have been charged with aiding and abetting Floyd's murder. The video also shows Lane pulling a gun on Floyd within 15 seconds of encountering him in a parked vehicle as he was investigating a complaint of a possible fake $20 bill. George Floyd can be heard repeating at least 25 times he cannot breathe, as well as telling the officers he had COVID-19. In North Carolina, a nurse and 5 guards at Forsyth County Jail faced charges of involuntary manslaughter over their roles in the death of 56-year-old African-American prisoner John Elliott Neville last December. The incident began when Neville reportedly fell from the top bunk of his prison bed onto a hard concrete floor. Newly released video shows guards handcuffing Neville, placing a bag over his head, and moving him to another cell. There, he's hogtied and pressed face first into the floor as he cries out for his mother and says, "I can't breathe," more than 20 times. After Neville becomes unresponsive, a nurse begins administering CPR. Neville died 2 days later in a hospital in Winston-Salem. An autopsy showed he was asphyxiated while restrained and suffered a brain injury after his heart stopped beating. In Baltimore, Maryland, a major gas explosion killed 1 woman and injured at least 7 others Monday. 3 homes were leveled. Investigators say it could take months to determine the cause of the devastating blast. President Trump's much-touted deal with Kodak has been put on hold amidst a probe launched by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The SEC is investigating after Kodak's stock surged just days after the company received a $765 million loan under the Defense Production Act. The loan was given to help Kodak start making prescription drugs, something it has never done before. And in Florida, a federal appeals court ruled it's unconstitutional for schools to ban transgender students from using the restroom corresponding to their gender identity. The case was brought by transgender teen Drew Adams, who battled his local school board for years after he was told he could no longer use the boys' bathroom. On Friday, the judges said, quote, "A public school may not punish its students for gender nonconformity nor harm transgender students by establishing arbitrary separate rules." And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by my co-host Juan Gonzalez, sheltering at home in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, we'll begin in Lebanon, where the government resigned Monday following days of protest after more than 200 people were killed and thousands injured in a devastating blast at Beirut's port. Dozens of people are still missing, many of them foreign workers. Prime Minister Hassan Diab announced his resignation in a televised address.
We follow
the will of the people to hold accountable those responsible for this disaster that has been in hiding for 7 years, and their desire for real change, from the corrupt, destructive state of brokerages and theft, to the state of law and justice and transparency, to a country that respects its people. In the face of this reality, we take a step back to stand with the people to undergo this battle of change with them. We want to open the door towards national salvation that the Lebanese people are taking part in, and thus I am announcing today the resignation of this government.
The Lebanese president, Michel Aoun, accepted Diab's resignation but asked him to stay on in a caretaker capacity until a new cabinet is formed. Last week's explosion was triggered by 2,700 tons of highly explosive ammonium nitrate left unattended in a warehouse at the port for over 6 years. The port blast came at a time when Lebanon's already facing political, economic, and public health crisis. Ziad Abu-Rish joins us now from Beirut, Lebanon, a historian and research fellow at the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies and co-director of Bard College's Master of Arts program in Human Rights and the Arts. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Ziad Abu-Rish. Can you start off by talking about the significance of the fall of the Lebanese government, but the fact that the government remains as a caretaker government, this as protesters continue to take to the streets in the midst of the aftermath of this horrific explosion.
Absolutely, Amy, and thank you for having me and shedding light on this important topic. The fall of the Diab government was a demand of protesters and critics of the government, as well as people who participated in the October 2019 revolution in Lebanon and had opposed the formation of this cabinet. However, I think it's also important to recognize that the fall of this government is also the product of internal conflicts between the various political parties that make up Lebanon's political class. You mentioned the issue of remaining in power as a caretaker government. This is actually a very normal state of affairs after governments submit their resignation. And in fact, the fall of cabinets and even the holding of early parliamentary elections are not necessarily signs that fundamental transformation is underway in Lebanon. For now, at least, this is politics as usual, and the big question for people is what is going to come in place of this cabinet that has just resigned in the wake of the very deadly and devastating explosion, and a cabinet that has failed to stem the tide of various financial, economic, health, and infrastructural crises.
And Ziad Abu-Rish, what about the president himself, Michel Aoun, and the other members of parliament? Are the protesters calling for a much more wholesale change in the government? And if so, what kind of structural changes do you think are needed in Lebanon today?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that protesters are not necessarily unified in their demands. However, I think they share a wholesale rejection of the status quo in which all major political parties in Lebanon are implicated. Whether it's President Michel Aoun or presidents that have come before him, whether it's Speaker of Parliament Nabih Berri, all members of parliament currently or former parliaments, this cabinet or former cabinets, they have collectively failed to deliver on any of the aspirations and needs of the majority of the people who live in Lebanon, including citizens, refugees, migrant workers, and other people. I think what we want to look for as we move forward as an indication if there's going to be structural change or not is who is going to be appointed to the next cabinet. Is this cabinet going to be an independent cabinet? Is it going to be comprised of competent persons? And is it going to be empowered to legislate the necessary laws that are required to begin the transformation of the political system in Lebanon and pave the way to some meaningful accountability and transparency? For example, the electoral law in Lebanon is constantly voted on and passed before each election cycle. Electoral laws, as you know, determine districting, the distribution of seats, and the threshold for making it into office. This has largely allowed for this political class to reproduce itself every time elections are held. And if the electoral law is not fundamentally changed, then there's no reason to suspect that new elections will result in an entirely new composition of this parliament. Of course, there are other reforms that we can think of that protesters have demanded for a long time, including judicial reform, for the creation of a truly independent judiciary, an addressment of the economic crisis, which has only continued to worsen. There has been no forensic audit to understand what happened and who is responsible. There have been no stopgap measures taken to prevent the continuous downward spiral. And of course, now in the wake of the explosion, any new cabinet is going to have to establish a meaningful investigation of the causes of the explosion and holding those people responsible. None of these things have happened, not in the Diab cabinet and not in other cabinets before then. And this is the fundamental issue here in Lebanon if anyone hopes to see the kind of transformation that most protesters are calling for.
Can you respond to the French president, Macron, coming to Lebanon? The opening sentence of an AP report on his trip begins, It was almost as if Emmanuel Macron forgot that Lebanon is no longer a French protectorate. He was in the streets before Lebanon's prime minister was. If you can talk about that relationship and also the $300 million that have been conferenced, a donors conference set up, and where that money would go.
Absolutely. Well, the fact that Macron was in the streets before the prime minister or any other major official in Lebanon is more a reflection of the unaccountability of the Lebanese political class to the population of Lebanon than it is the goodwill intentions of the president of France. I think Macron was trying to seize the initiative for France and the European Union to get ahead of the United States in paving a way for some type of exit of the political and multiple crises in Lebanon. And he is perhaps even trying to reposition France in relation to Lebanon and the broader Middle East. That being said, I think it's important to note that France, the United States, the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, as well as other powers like Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, are all complicit in helping create, maintain, and sustain the political system in Lebanon that most protesters are calling for the downfall of. So this is either an 11th hour about-face turn by the Macron government and France more generally, or it's a cynical attempt to reestablish relationships. And as you mentioned yourself with that AP report, France was responsible for creating the state of Lebanon in the aftermath of World War II and was a colonial power from 1918 to 1946 when it withdrew. Most of the structural and institutional arrangements that are with us today in Lebanon were introduced and facilitated through French governance practices during the colonial period. And I think if France wants to really change its relationship with Lebanon or champion the aspirations of the people in Lebanon, it should at least begin with a public apology and taking responsibility for its role, past and present, from the establishment of Lebanon through the civil war and afterwards in contributing to this situation, even though, as I always say, the primary responsibility for the status quo in Lebanon is first and foremost amongst the political parties that make up the political class here in Lebanon. That being said, outside powers have continuously aided and abetted them through financial aid, diplomatic support, and other means.
I'm wondering if you could talk about the role of Hezbollah in the current situation. Clearly, the Lebanese government is trying to get financial assistance from the International Monetary Fund, yet Hezbollah was very closely tied to the Diop government. Could you talk about that relationship and how this affects the standing of Hezbollah within the multi-party situation that has existed in Lebanon for so many years?
Absolutely. Well, I think we should start by making clear that Hezbollah is a part of the political system and the political class in Lebanon. It has participated in various parliaments. It has participated in various governments. And Hezbollah is perhaps the most powerful political party here in Lebanon. It has used this power to buttress the political system in Lebanon, and it has used that power to oppose and confront protesters in Lebanon. So I think that's very important to make clear, and that any fundamental transformation, as protesters are demanding, killon yani killon, all of them means all of them, includes a fundamental rethinking of the role of Hezbollah in local politics here. That being said, I think a focus on Hezbollah as the panacea for the problems of Lebanon misses the broader constellation of political forces and parties that have helped create, maintain, and benefit from the system in place. I think we need to distinguish between legitimate criticisms and opposition to Hezbollah as a part of the broader political and economic system in Lebanon, and what I would call illegitimate criticisms of Hezbollah, those that are simply seek to reshuffle the chairs in Lebanon, to restructure the balance of power in Lebanon in the favor of other members of the political class at the exclusion of Hezbollah. If we think that any solution to the fundamental problems of Lebanon can be achieved by simply eliminating Hezbollah from the equation, then we are misreading the situation on the ground. It is part and parcel of the problem but as is all major politicians and all major political parties, especially those that have been backed by the United States, Saudi Arabia, France, and others in the Western world.
Ziad, we just have 10 seconds, but do you expect the protests on the ground in this ravaged capital of Beirut to intensify?
I do suspect that they will intensify, but it's always the case. The challenge is, can they translate their presence on the ground into meaningful pressure for institutional and structural change in Lebanon? I wish them the best. I am admired and in awe of their bravery and courage despite repeated crises and traumas. And we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Ziad Abu-Rish, I want to thank you for being with us, research fellow at the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies in Beirut, co-director of the master's program in human rights and the arts at Bard College. When we come back, we speak to The Atlantic's Ed Young about how the coronavirus has humbled and humiliated the planet's most powerful nation. Stay with us. The Lebanese musician Flügen. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. The world has passed a grim milestone, 20 million coronavirus cases. Over 5 million of the confirmed infections are here in the United States. Although the U.S. has just 5% of the world's population, it has more than a quarter, more than 25% of all the coronavirus infections and deaths, with a death toll of over 163,000, by far the world's largest. The United States has recorded more than 500,000 new cases so far in August. That's more cases than any European country has recorded since the pandemic began. This comes as millions of parents are now deciding whether it's safe to send their kids back to school. A new report by the American Academy of Pediatrics found nearly 100,000 children contracted COVID-19 in just the last 2 weeks of July alone. Meanwhile, the Centers for Disease Control reports children of color are disproportionately being hospitalized. Latinx kids are 8 times more likely to be hospitalized than white children. Black children are 5 times as likely. Latinx and black children also make up nearly 3/4 of the cases of the rare but deadly multi-system inflammatory syndrome, which has been associated with COVID-19. We're joined now by Ed Young, science reporter at The Atlantic. His new article, How the Pandemic Defeated America. It's the cover story of the new issue of The Atlantic. Ed Young begins his piece, how did it come to this? A virus 1,000 times smaller than a dust mote has humbled and humiliated the planet's most powerful nation. America has failed to protect its people, leaving them with illness and financial ruin. It has lost its status as a global leader. It's careened between inaction and ineptitude. The breadth and magnitude of its errors are difficult in the moment to truly fathom. Ed Young, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Okay, how did it happen, and how can it be fixed?
I wrote 8,000 words about it, but to try and summarize, I think there's 2 main things we need to talk about. One is the devastatingly inept response to the pandemic over this year. The Trump administration has utterly failed the American people. It has failed to take the lead. It has failed to listen to experts. It has failed to roll out a workable plan to get testing in place, to steel the country, to ensure protective supplies are rolled out. out. It has failed in almost every conceivable way to deal with a pandemic that many other nations have brought to heel within a similar amount of time. More importantly, I think it has failed to honor the sacrifices that Americans have made in spring, when everyone obeyed social restrictions, when they stayed at home, when they uprooted their lives at significant financial and emotional cost. That time was meant to be used to prepare the nation for what was to come, and it was squandered. So that's one aspect of it. But I think the other that we really do need to grapple with is that the coronavirus exploited vulnerabilities that have been existing in American society for decades and centuries, well before the Trump administration. So the underfunding of public health, the overpacked prisons, the understaffed nursing homes, the health inequalities that have been brewing for all of America's history due to its legacy of colonialism and racism. All of those things contributed to how bad things are, the statistics that you read out at the start of this segment. And all of those vulnerabilities need to be addressed going forward if we are going to be better able to deal with the pandemics of the future.
I wanted to ask you, the Trump administration is clearly betting a lot on being able to have a vaccine as soon as possible. The president has actually talked about the possibility of November for a vaccine. But the reality is that even the clinical trial now underway, the Moderna trial, has only registered 5,000 of 30,000 volunteers that it needs to enroll in this clinical trial. This emphasis on the vaccine as the key solution. I'm wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, even if everything goes right in the vaccine development process, and there's no guarantee that will happen, even if we do get a vaccine ahead of schedule, then there are all kinds of problems left. There are logistical problems. How do you deliver that vaccine into people's arms? Do we trust a government that has utterly failed to provide things like protective equipment or to roll out a workable national plan to handle the logistics of getting millions of vaccine doses to an adult population who is typically not the group that is usually vaccinated? Are we confident that a program called Operation Warp Speed, which has trumpeted speed more than anything else, will do all the necessary steps required to make people comfortable about the efficacy and safety of a vaccine? That public trust, which is so diminished right now, is really important. And I think that's going to be a problem that people who are banking on the vaccine are not really fully grappling with. And finally, I think you're hinting at something really important, that we always, and by we, I mean society in general, and I think the Trump administration in particular, is banking on biomedical silver bullets, things that are just going to, a shot in the arm that is going to fix everything. And I don't think it's going to be that simple. Even when a vaccine comes out, as I said, it's going to take a long time for it to actually get to people. And there are things we can do now, right now, that will make a difference. Testing is still so important. Social interventions like giving people paid sick leave or ensuring wider healthcare coverage, all of those things can make a difference to people's health in the moment without having to wait for the biomedical enterprise to save us.
And this whole issue of such a simple public health measure like testing and tracking of those with positive results. Why has there been such a colossal failure on the part of the U.S. government in dealing with the issue of testing?
It's truly astonishing. I think, at the start, some of the problems have been well documented. The CDC tried to roll out a test. It didn't really work. Private labs tried to jump in and help out, but were strangled by FDA bureaucracy. And these problems rolled on and exacerbated because because the US fell behind in those early days. It then competed with basically the rest of the world for reagents and for swabs and all the equipment that you needed to test. why we are continuing to fail at testing is just utterly baffling. Many people have called for rapid diagnostic tests that are a little less sensitive, but can deliver results very, very quickly. That is incredibly important because at the moment, tests are taking weeks, a week plus to return results, which is completely useless for the point of view, from the perspective of actually controlling the virus, working out where the pandemic is continuing to cause problems. We need a really coordinated testing plan. I think the real answer to your question, why this is still plaguing the country, is that there just has been no leadership. The logistical expertise to create a functioning testing plan across the country has not been marshaled, and that's to the detriment of all of us.
On Monday, President Trump was questioned about his support for reopening in-person schools during the pandemic. This is what he said.
97,000 children tested positive for coronavirus in the last 2 weeks in July, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics. Does that give you any pause about schools reopening for in-person learning?
Because they may have, as you would call it, a case, and maybe a case, but it's also a case where there's a tiny fraction of death, tiny fraction, and they get better very quickly. Yeah, they may have it for a short period of time, but as you know, the seriousness of it in terms of what it leads to is extraordinarily small, very, very much less than 1%.
So I want to ask you a multi-part question on this. About misinformation and whether you think journalists should refuse to go to these daily coronavirus press briefings unless President Trump has scientists at his side. Number two, this issue of the children, and particularly kids of color. Latinx kids, 8 times more likely to be hospitalized. Black children, 5 times more likely. And 75% more chance of getting this multi-system disorder that can kill. How little these disparities are talked about, and do you think they weigh into President Trump just disregarding them? By the way, his own kid won't be going back in person to school because their school is closed.
Okay, so to the first point, I don't think that journalists should be airing these briefings live. I think they are among the most potent sources of misinformation and disinformation to the public right now. And, maybe clips of them along with the actual contextualizing information people need to make sense of it. But don't air them live. I think that in terms of your other question, the racial disparities, the Atlantic's Adam Server wrote a piece that Trump took the virus seriously until he worked out who was actually dying from it. We see from reports from Catherine Eban from Vanity Fair that testing plans were plans to control the pandemic were shelved when it became clear that it was disproportionately targeting blue states and minorities. There is, I think one should always stick to Hanlon's razor, assuming incompetence instead of malice, but there is increasing evidence that malice was part of this, and I think that is deeply worrying for what's to come. And you've read out statistics about the way the virus infects children, the lower relative risk of infection or death. That's important, sure, but we need to remember that this is a pandemic which is still raging wildly throughout America. And the problem is that if you have an uncontrolled pandemic, not only do you have massive community spread, which is a problem if you open schools in those communities, but rare events then become hugely problematic. If you have millions of people being infected, something that only happens to 1% of them is still going to affect huge swaths of the population. So the fact that something is relatively rare doesn't make it safe in the context of a pandemic that is raging out of control, which is exactly what we are still seeing.
And Ed Young, I wanted to ask you, in your article for The Atlantic, how the pandemic defeated America, you also look into the role of social media platforms in spreading disinformation or misinformation to the American public. And you write, quote, the same social media platforms that sowed partisanship and transfer and misinformation during the 2014 Ebola outbreak in Africa and the 2016 U.S. election became vectors for conspiracy theories during the 2020 pandemic. Could you expound on that?
Yeah, we know that things like platforms like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, spread misinformation more quickly than they do information. And that's because they're governed by algorithms that are designed to keep users engaged, to keep their attention on the site. And they do that by feeding them content that veers towards extreme, veers towards being very polarized, and that stokes heavy emotion, regardless of whether that content is true, and whether it is dangerous or not. And these problems have been well recognized. This is the core theme of my Atlantic piece, that all of our problems in this pandemic were predictable and preventable. People were talking about social media platforms acting as radicalization engines, and that is exactly what we're seeing now. They spread misinformation, and they contribute to this vortex of fear and uncertainty in which people are trapped. So we are all worried, we are all concerned for our families, our friends, and we feel that we sate that worry by looking for more information. But we are looking for that information on channels that feed us falsehoods, that feed us polarizing information. And so that just worsens the feelings of fear and anxiety, which causes us to seek out even more information, which worsens the problem. And it spirals. That is exactly what we are seeing now in this pandemic, and it's contributing to the problems that we're experiencing.
When you talk about a non-technical fix, I mean, in terms of, for example, a vaccine that we have to focus on now, what many countries have gotten under control, the coronavirus pandemic, through masks, through testing, in both cases, it's not just that the president has not invoked the Defense Production Act to the level of just ensuring everyone has it. In many places, it's getting far worse. But I wanted to go to the issue of Medicare for All, Ed. We're moving into the Democratic National Convention next week. And the executive committee, writing the platform, Joe Biden has made it very clear he's against Medicare for All. Amazingly, in the latest vote on the platform, against Medicare for All. How significant do you think, and do you think this pandemic and its disparate effects on the population of this country, especially communities of color, do you think that Medicare for All would make an enormous difference in how it's possible that the opposing party is saying absolutely not at this point, when many polls show it is the most popular answer to the health crisis we have in this country?
Yeah, America's system of employer-tied insurance, which is unique in the world, is undoubtedly contributing to the disparities that we are seeing. It disadvantages poor communities, it disadvantages communities of color, Black and Latinx communities that have been disproportionately hit by this virus. And we know that those disparities and this system of healthcare inequity is a legacy of the racism that America has always struggled with. Since the end of the Civil War, throughout the Jim Crow era, healthcare access was pushed away from Black communities and other communities of color. And that goes right up to the opposition to the expansion of Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. And that has led to continuing gulfs in people being able to access healthcare that is contributing to the disproportionate toll that this virus has taken upon communities of color. Even before the pandemic started, America was rated by some global indices as being the most prepared nation in the world. That seems a bit ludicrous in hindsight. But even then, in terms of healthcare access, America was rated as 175th out of 195 different countries. This was always known to be a massive vulnerability that would cost the country dearly during a crisis of this kind. And sure enough, it has in a very preventable, very tragic way. And this has to be addressed. If we can't use the lessons from this pandemic to realize that universal healthcare is a thing we have to fight for, I don't know whether we're going to do any better, not just for the future phases of this pandemic, but for future pandemics to come and all the other health problems that we still need to deal with.
And Ed Young, I wanted to ask you about the Trump administration's continued isolationism in terms of, for instance, the attempts to demonize China as the source of the pandemic and constantly criticizing and attacking the World Health Organization. Yet China has, even though the virus started there, has been able to contain it dramatically. What has the Chinese government done right compared to what the U.S. government has done?
China clearly made missteps earlier on. There were problems with transparency, of alerting the world to problems early on. These were issues that have been problems since the original SARS in 2003. But China did take steps to control the pandemic. I think what we really need to remember now is that the pandemic shows how quickly diseases can spread around the world, and that no country can stand alone. No country can wall itself off from the rest of the globe and expect to be fine. The world needs to work together to deal with with threats like this. The word pandemic comes from the Greek panendemos, all citizens, all people, and that is what is required to deal with these problems. The United States now, in seeking this isolationist stance, in pulling back from the WHO and other international alliances, is really shooting itself in the foot. You could argue that China made missteps early on and that we need new international norms to stop those lack of transparency from manifesting again. But it's the international community that's going to create the legal structures and the norms that will ensure that the entire world is better prepared for the next crisis. And if America withdraws, it is losing its seat at the table. It is losing positions of influence, and it is allowing those norms to be drawn without it. Now, maybe some people think that America doesn't need the rest of the world, but they're wrong. And by forfeiting that standing, that position of diplomatic power, it really is, I think, taking steps that will cost it in the future.
Finally, we just have 10 seconds, but I wanted to ask you about the highest level U.S. delegation led by Alex Azar, the head of Health and Human Services, to Taiwan. Clearly, Trump wants to stick a finger in the eye of China. But what would be very important here is if the U.S. learned the lesson of Taiwan and how it dealt with the pandemic immediately, going to testing, national responses to testing and protective gear and masks, a true lesson for the United States to learn.
Yeah, I think humility would be an amazing lesson to learn. Other countries have dealt with this pandemic well. And if America can actually shed the sense of exceptionalism and look to what other nations have done well, maybe we can learn lessons that will protect people in the future.
Ed Young, we want to thank you so much for being with us, science writer at The Atlantic, who's been covering the pandemic extensively since March. His cover story we will link to is titled, How the Pandemic Defeated America. Next, we go to San Quentin Prison. We go inside, where 25 prisoners and a guard have died from COVID-19, the nation's largest coronavirus outbreak. We'll hear from 2 prisoners who contracted the disease. Stay with us.
Give me all your love now, 'cause for all we know, we might be dead by tomorrow.
I'd Be Dead by Tomorrow by Soko. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we turn to California, where the state's San Quentin prison faces the country's largest coronavirus outbreak. At least 2,200 prisoners have been infected with the virus. 25 have died. More than 260 staff at San Quentin have also been infected. Prison guard Gilbert Polanco is now the first to die after he reportedly worked extra shifts when dozens of his fellow guards fell ill with the disease. Executions have been on hold in California since last year, but the latest prisoner to die on Sunday was Pedro Arias, who'd been on San Quentin's death row since 1990. Democracy Now! Spoke by phone with incarcerated journalist Juan Haynes, who's among the thousands at San Quentin who've been infected with COVID-19, about why the prison, which was built in the 1850s, is facing this coronavirus outbreak.
The architectural design of California prisons are not fit for human occupations. It's just not. But we're a resilient species, and we adapt to whatever the physical environment is. But the unfortunate thing is that the virus doesn't care about that adaptation. That's why so many people in San Quentin are dying, because we can't physically distance ourselves from each other. And what's so hurtful about this fact that we can't physically distance from each other, so any type of contagion that gets inside of this prison is going to spread like wildfire.
That's incarcerated journalist Juan Haynes speaking by phone from San Quentin. He recently co-wrote a piece for The Appeal headlined "At San Quentin, Overcrowding Laid the Groundwork for an Explosive COVID-19 Outbreak." Some prisoners report being punished with solitary confinement and squalid conditions for getting sick. This is 52-year-old Michael Adams, who spoke to Democracy Now! Producer Libby Rainey by phone last week.
Call it the bowels of San Quentin because it's so dark, it's so dank. There was no electricity. Hot water was sparse. And the cells are smaller than the ones that are north of. And for the 43 days that I was back there, the person that had come in the cell with me had more property than I had. So we're literally crawling over boxes in a cell that's smaller than the average 5x9 just to be able to use the bathroom and things like that. Absolutely crazy. Showering once a week, phone calls once a week, and no medical attention save them coming to the cells and asking for oxygen. Leaving oxygen reading. And then there was a thing where the people that were coming in and taking the oxygen readings and the temperature readings, they were trying to figure out why do you need this? And they're like, well, we need statistics, we need data.
Do you know any of the people that have actually died?
I've known about 2 of the people who have died.
That's San Quentin prisoner Michael Adams describing what he called the bowels of San Quentin prison, where some of the prisoners who got sick with COVID-19, like himself, were put. For more, we're joined by James King, state campaigner for the Oakland-based Alabeka Center for Human Justice, member of the Stop San Quentin Outbreak Coalition. He himself incarcerated at San Quentin from 2013 until last December and has been monitoring the situation there closely. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, James. If you can elaborate on what these prisoners have said. We spoke to Juan before he got COVID-19, when he was saying this place is going to suffer an outbreak like we've never seen before if the state doesn't do something about this now. Can you explain what happened and what needs to be done now, James?
Sure. On May 31st, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation made the decision to transfer 121 people from California Institution for Men, which at the time was the largest outbreak in the state, to San Quentin State Prison, the oldest prison in the state.
That was in Chino?
It was a horrible... That was Chino. And at the time, San Quentin was already well over 120% of capacity. So to bring in the additional people, many of them actually already showing symptoms on the bus ride to San Quentin, turned out to be a horrific debacle and mistake. The conditions at San Quentin are horrific. They're in West Block and North Block, which are where most of the population is housed. Those two buildings are each designed to hold a little bit over 400 people. They both hold close to 800 people within them. There's no ventilation within the buildings. The windows are, in fact, welded shut, and the ventilator system hasn't been turned on in several years. There are also no access to cleaning supplies or very limited access to basic hygiene products in addition to everything else. So you have these tightly confined spaces where people are living in close proximity to each other with no ability to physically distance.
And what steps are you calling for officials to take in terms of releasing people from from San Quentin? And your reaction to Governor Newsom saying that he will not release any prisoners who have been convicted of violent offenses?
Well, two things. Number one is we've been horrified to note that at San Quentin, 10 weeks after the outbreak, the prison is still at over 100% capacity. Public health officials in mid-June called for a dramatic reduction. They said that at least a 50% reduction needs to happen in the population there and at every prison throughout the state and country, frankly. In order to get there, you have to stop looking at what a person may have done 20, 30, 40 years ago. Quite frankly, the vast overwhelming majority of people incarcerated at San Quentin are not a threat to public safety. And that idea that they would be still violent or still a threat is contradicted by the California Department of Correction and Rehabilitation's own data. I think the vast majority can be released safely and urgently in order to bring down in order to flatten the curve on the virus.
And what's your sense of how the media coverage of the situation in America's prisons and California prisons in particular, how the media is covering this issue?
I think that it's been largely problematic in two senses. One is this idea that these are merely prison outbreaks. I understand it's built off of decades of otherizing and demonizing people who have committed harmful acts in our country. But when we and think of this as only prison outbreaks and ignore the fact that hundreds of people are traveling inside and outside of these outbreaks daily and working in them and then returning to their families and to the community, it causes us to create bad policy as it relates to pausing this pandemic. But then secondly, there was a headline recently that said that saying that California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation was releasing murderers. Well, that's not true. What they're releasing are people who have dealt with their harmful acts, who have been safe and have not conducted any violence in decades. So the rhetoric around the labels of people who committed harmful acts like 20, 30, 40 years ago is presenting them as static and still a threat to public safety, ignores the larger threat to public safety, which is the pandemic and the virus itself.
James, this is from the Los Angeles Times. San Quentin's death toll translates to a mortality rate of about 767 people dying out of every 100,000. It would be as if right now the United States had 2.5 million deaths from COVID-19. We heard the prisoner Juan Haynes, who we've had on Democracy Now! Several times, who came down with COVID, is suing. We just have 20 seconds. What is this lawsuit?
This lawsuit, this habeas, is just saying that hospitals are not equipped to deal with this pandemic. There's no way a prison can. And as Juan said earlier, this is a situation where the prison cannot keep people safe, so people need to be released so that they can safely isolate and quarantine and flatten the curve of this virus.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us. We'll continue to be on the story. James King, state campaigner for the Oakland-based Ella Baker Center for Human Justice and a member of the Stop San Quentin Outbreak Coalition. That does it for our show. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Stay safe, save lives, wear a mask.